morning. Thank you for being here on this beautiful, actually, finally, spring day. Took us a little while to get here, but it is a lovely day. We're really happy to have you on campus in this beautiful facility for a day of fairly difficult conversation. So at least we'll leaven that difficult conversation with the joy that we are all alive and getting to enjoy the beautiful flowers that are blooming outside. So my name is Wendell Pritchett. I'm the provost of the University of Pennsylvania. It's my pleasure to welcome you here to Perry World House, to Philadelphia, and to the conference entitled Ordering the Human, Global Science, and Racial Reason, which is sponsored by the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society, and by the Center on Africana Studies. So you have a very full day, and I promise I'm going to be brief. You're not you're not here to listen to me, and I'm going to turn it over to Professor Roberts in a minute. But I do just want to share a couple of thoughts about this really important work that you're doing here and in all of your lives. So we're honored to host this symposium. Equally honored to be Penn to be home to the Penn Program on Race, Science, and Society, and its visionary leader, my good friend Dorothy Roberts. This symposium comes at an opportune moment, though it seems like we have a lot of opportune moments in our lives right now. And one of the ways that this is an opportune moment, I'm sure you're familiar with the recent groundbreaking Chetty-Henren study on race and intergenerational economic opportunity. If you're not familiar, I urge you to read it and read about it. It was released last month. And it reminds us what we already know, which is that racial disparities continue to plague this nation. It's not surprising, but at the same time, as somebody who studies this field himself, it's not surprising to me, but the extent of the disparities and the depth of the disparities and the length that we've been struggling with these things is disheartening, but it also gives us even more motivation to continue to work on these issues. And these disparities obviously are directly relevant, though the purview of the Program on Race, Science, and Society is even broader, but they're directly relevant to the goals of the center, which are, one, to promote social justice, and two, to dispel the myth that race is a natural division of human beings, right? We know it isn't. As the Chetty-Henren study shows, this unnatural division continues to inflict nearly incalculable harm on in general, not merely in social justice, but in society, right? Affecting all of us, whether we realize it or not. Human health, economic opportunity, and education, just to name three key areas. So this symposium gives us an opportunity to examine the scientific methods that continue to prop up this unnatural state of affairs, and how as scholars we can work individually and collectively to combat the continuation of these unnatural trends. And of course, there's no better person that I know to lead this effort than Dorothy Roberts. So as she's noted, race is still typically the first or second thing that we see when we first meet a person. She writes that race is often a determining factor, if not the determining factor, in choosing where most Americans go to worship, where to buy a home, the music they listen to, and their choice of a spouse. Dorothy is an internationally recognized scholar of race, gender, and the law, and author of several books. In addition to leading our program on race, science, and society, she's the George A. Weiss University professor and the Raymond Sadie Alexander Professor of Civil Rights in the law school. I think Dorothy might have the longest title of anybody, but all of those titles are well-deserved. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dorothy Roberts.
Oh, good morning, everybody. Good morning. And thank you, Provost Pritchett, for that very gracious welcome and for your support of the Program on Race, Science, and Society. As Provost Pritchett just announced, I'm Dorothy Roberts. I'm the director of the Program on Race, Science, and Society, and I also warmly welcome you to Ordering the Human, Global Science, and Racial Reason. Race and science have been intimately connected at the global level from the very inception of the European Enlightenment. Western scientists invented the idea that all human beings around the world were universally divided into a handful of discrete races. And they fit those classifications into their typologies that were ordering the entire universe, including plants and animals. And of course, they put themselves at the top of the typology, and they put Africans who they wanted to enslave at the bottom of the order. Enlightenment thinkers imported into their scientific revolution the backward notion that some natural power, whether it was God or whether it was evolution, that was what created the unequal human order, not political power. Those creationist notions became the foundational logic that justified violent domination and unequal life chances across the globe. And those very same racial logics have continued to circulate globally as if they were universal, stable, and natural. As scientists around the world continue to incorporate racial understandings of human difference in their research, this classification system still determines health outcomes, resource allocation, power arrangements, and social policies globally. When I came to Penn in 2012, I'd been studying the alarming resurgence of biological concepts of race in US genomic research, biomedicine, and biotechnology since the mapping of the human genome. And I founded the Penn program on race, science, and society to foster transformative approaches to the role of race in science through engagement with scientists, scholars, and students from disciplines all across Penn, both the biological sciences and the social sciences, and the law and the humanities. My aim was to develop innovative solutions for moving forward in a scientifically valid and socially equitable way. I believe we can conduct scientific research that promotes social justice. Don't think there's anything wrong with that. That doesn't make us, not neutral or objective, and that dispels the deadly myth that race is a natural division of human beings. This symposium seeks to accomplish PRSS's mission at a global level by bringing together a magnificent, I'm just so happy to see you all, a group of international scholars, scientists, historians, legal scholars, to ask, how is race as a unit of analysis defined, operationalized, and reconstituted through scientific and biomedical practices in various national and political contexts? As Provost Pritchett indicated, this question could not be more urgent. In the United States and Europe, right-wing movements are voicing more loudly and violently their claims of white superiority and exclusion, while liberals are more willing to accept racial science as long as they can pretend it can be divorced from blatant racism. Other regions, too, around the world are grappling with the past and future significance of race and science to national identities and power dynamics. We hope our conversation today can be a starting point to uncover and analyze the global role of racial science and to strategize possible ways out of the naturalization of race. So I have many, many people to thank for their vital support of this symposium. First, I'd like to thank our co-sponsors, especially the Center for Africana Studies, where PRSS is housed. Also the Department of Anthropology, the Department of English, Fell's Policy Institute, the Department of History and Sociology of Science, Penn Medicine's Office of Inclusion and Diversity. Special thanks to Perry Worldhouse, who provided this beautiful space for our symposium, the Department of Philosophy, the Department of Sociology, South Asia Studies, and also 8th grader Bona Yu. I don't know if you want to stand up, Bona, who raised over $1,000 with bake sales and other efforts because of her interest in this topic and donated it to PRSS out of the blue. So I special thanks to you, Bona. We're also especially indebted to the Center for Africana Studies staff, Gail Garrison, Shantala Thompson, Tia Campbell, and Sean Fields, who worked tirelessly for at least a year, maybe more, and masterfully to pull together every detail needed for this symposium. We could not have done it without your help. Thanks so much. Also, an army of graduate students. You'll see them walking around. Here's one right here, who are helping out today as escorts at the registration table and generally keeping us organized and everything flowing properly. Finally, I'm extremely grateful to PRSS postdoctoral fellow Iram Alam. Where's Iram? In the bag, yes. Iram helped me flesh out this idea I had some time ago for a global symposium and turn it into a reality. She's been absolutely indispensable to PRSS's work for 2 years during her fellowship, and I'm absolutely thrilled to send her off this summer for the coveted position of assistant professor in Harvard's History of Science department. So thanks and congratulations, Iram. All right, so let's get started. Please refer to your programs for the agenda for the day. You'll find details about the schedule for the 4 panels, as well as bios for the speakers and commentators. So we'll just have short introductions at the beginning of each panel, and you can read more about everybody in the program. At the end of each session, there'll be about 15 minutes reserved for questions from the audience, and we'll break for lunch at the end of panel 2 at 12:30, if we can keep on time, and resume for panels 3 and 4 at 1:30. So let's get started with our first panel on individuals and composites, or composites, as my dear husband said it should be pronounced. And enjoy the symposium. Thanks so much.
Good morning and welcome. It's an honor to be chairing the first panel. This is a very exciting moment to have this all begin. I see friends in the audience. We've been talking about this, as Dorothy said, for a very long time. The first panel today is on individuals and composites. And as I said to Aram, being old, I call that individuals and populations, but I'm sure it means something slightly different in these terms. The first speaker is going to be Ahmad Macharik, and I will let her say a bit about who she is and then go on with her work. And as Dorothy said, there's information in the bio, in the book. Thank you.
So just to be clear, this is for the PowerPoint? Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Pamela, for opening this panel. Thank you all for being here. Thanks to the organizers for this wonderful event, especially Aram and Dorothy for inviting me. So this is a paper that has been in the making for quite some time. Oh, I'm supposed to say a little bit of who I am. I am Ahmad Macharik from the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I am a professor in anthropology of science, so I work in anthropology and science and technology studies on race, genetics, forensics, and you will get a little bit of that later on as I move. So as I said, a paper in the making for quite some time, and it has to do also with a kind of topic, which is sameness in relation to race. So, well, difference has always been a matter of concern in the studies of race. In this paper, I want to change perspective and attend to practices of doing sameness, or practices of doing sameness, to see what we might learn from that about race. And I do so by analyzing an exemplary forensic DNA case. It is a Dutch case, very specific, but I hope we can learn something more general of it. It's a Dutch case, the Dutch Marianne Vaatstra. And this is a case about a 16-year-old girl, Marianne Vaatstra, who was sexually abused and murdered after a night of partying. Her body was found on a meadow on the 1st of May, 1999, in a rural area in the northern part of the country, in Friesland. And as it happens, this meadow was not too far away from a center for asylum seekers. So you can understand what happened. Immediately, suspicion was placed on the inhabitants of the center by the local community, mostly, but I think in the beginning, the whole of the Netherlands. Yet the evidence that was collected at the crime scene did not provide much clue about the identity of the suspect. It would take 13 years before the case could be solved and the suspect identified. And throughout these years, various different forensic DNA technologies would be applied in the hope to discover his identity. Finally, it was disclosed through a dragnet, so a population screening, as part of a so-called DNA familiar searching, and I will explain later what that means. Now, in this paper presentation, there will be two technologies that are relevant. One is DNA phenotyping, so going from DNA to the appearance of the suspect, producing a photo, a portrait of this unknown person. So DNA phenotyping and familiar searching, so trying to infer the identity of the suspect through his relatives. And I will detail out how and under which circumstances these technologies were used in the case to analyze various versions of sameness that they helped to bring about. It will hopefully become clear that these technologies come with a particular idea about the collective, but also how these very technologies produce the collective. So these are versions that interact, versions of the collective that interact in the interaction between science and society, tend to become racialized in this specific setting. And before going into the details of the case, I would like to give you just a little bit of theoretical background of this thinking on sameness, because it really, the work is not done. It is just thinking out loud in the hope to get a better grasp of it. Now, studies of race have mainly attended to modes of doing differences, as I indicated, and indeed, an emphasis on difference seemed to suggest that when it comes to race, differences might be political or a negative, whereas similarities are curiously apolitical. And although it is acknowledged that the politics of race is obviously about the doing of differences and similarities, the latter, similarities, is usually taken for granted. And this might have a deeper structural root. So the Dutch historian and political scientist Siep Stuurman has written a seminal book, The Invention of Humanity. This is, I think, the Dutch version of it, but it has been translated now and published with Harvard University Press in 2017. So in this book, he shows that the history of modernity and modern states of justice are based on sameness of humans as the norm, and that their equality before the law as its consequences. He argues that historically, there have been three crucial modalities that help to invent this thing that we call humanity. First, this is the acknowledgement of a common humanness. That is, humans belong to the same species. Second, this is the anthropological turn through which cultural differences came to be understood as variations on a common theme, so a shared human culture. And thirdly, a temporal regime that helped to think civilization in terms of an evolutionary development. So some people are not there yet, but they will arrive in time to come. And although these three modes that have helped to establish this paradigm of humanities have been widely shared across the world, the coupling of equality and sameness has become pivotal in racial Europe during the Enlightenment. The dictum was, to become equal is to become like those who are already equal, that is, the European whites. And to arrive at that, everybody had to be enlightened, of course. Now, the crux of Stuurman's argument is that sameness had become a normative baseline, and difference and deviancy typically attract attention, alarm, extra policy, interventions, etc. Now, in the social studies of the life sciences, it has also been the science of difference, of course, that caught our attention, I should say, and I'm also part of that. And this has produced incredible and invaluable scholarship on race and science. But we did not quite begin to ask the question of sameness, what it is, how it is arrived at, what the politics thereof. And I should say that I have been alerted recently to the issue of sameness because of the Dutch situation, a situation of xenophobia coupled with nationalism, a kind of naturalization of what Dutchness is. These are things that are quite new in our society. But also because of the Marianne Vaatstra case in particular, it made me think about race and sameness, as hopefully will become clear from the presentation. Now, Stuurman's historical analysis resonates also with another theoretical inspiration that I have come across that has been developed by the philosophers and psychoanalysts Deleuze and Guattari in their work A Thousand Plateaux. Now, in one of their essays that is called Year Zero, Faciality, they argue that faces are not basically individual, but semiotic fields that are capable of making sociality. So this is a process that they have called facialization. They state that concrete faces cannot be assumed to come ready-made. They are engendered by this abstract machine of faciality, visagité. In their terms, the faciality machine in terms of the faciality machine, there cannot be an appeal on a pre-existing subject whose face we can see and learn about him or her. The abstract machine of faciality brings subjects into being, but also produces sameness among them, and here was my surprise when I read that. In their specific case, it produces whiteness, the white man face. And they say about racism, racism never detects the particles of the other. It propagates waves of sameness until those who resist identification have been wiped out. There are only people who should be like us and whose crime it is not to be. So the faciality machine functions as a political device and creates faces by eroding diversity and reproducing sameness. This is the work of the physical anthropology that has been, of course, is still here among us, so to speak. While facialization operates through this abstract machine that makes sameness, those who do not move on the wave of sameness are bestialized, become killable, erasable. In Stuurman's, the historian's sense, they do not enter the realm of humanity. And I think these insights about facialization, racialization of sameness, as well as the radical othering of non-same, is strikingly relevant in the context of forensics. And I hope then that the Marianne Vaatstra case will help me to illustrate that. Now, my analysis is part of a larger project that I will just briefly say something about here. This is the Race Face ID project, which is a 5-year research project with a large team of PhD students, postdocs, and myself, in which we study forensic technologies of face making and attend to how this giving of a face to an unknown person, a suspect or a victim, goes hand in hand with the doing of race. And it allows us to study then what precisely is race made to be, how does it change across different sites of forensics. Now, one of the key technologies of face making is DNA phenotyping that I will also be talking about here, which is about the physical appearance of the unknown person. It is after the externally visible characteristics. Now, not much can be said about these visible appearances except for sex differences, geographical descent, and there are 2 further markers that are validated and used in the criminal investigation. These are the color of the hair and of the iris. But there's a long list of other markers that are candidates for future use, so to speak. So it's a nascent science with lots of people working hard, and you can see some of the hopes for the future, which makes this field a promissory field. So DNA phenotyping is typically a promissory technology. Okay. So there is this promise of the face of this unknown person and ultimately identifying this unknown person. I found it interesting that if you look into this field, it is these technologies have a particular purpose, and I want to share with you this quote on that gives us pause when thinking about this future face making. It's ask this question, does the drawing need to look exactly like the perpetrator to be effective? So here we are talking about a composite drawing by the hand, so to speak. No, it does not. The likeness should be as accurate as possible. In many cases, this general likeness stimulates recognition on the part of the viewers who in contrast to the commonly held belief that highly detailed photographic images are more effective, these images actually narrow the scope of interpretation on the part of the viewer. So this means then that incompleteness is a virtue in this field. It is a virtue because these technologies are not about the individual suspect, but about producing a suspect population. And this incompleteness introduces or invites the public to engage with these images and to help in the criminal investigation. And this is, of course, also the trouble with the technology, that it doesn't produce an individual but a collective. We are talking about a context of crime, and we are talking about biology and genetics, so you can imagine that we are talking also about a kind of an explosive trio at work here. Since I have only 10 minutes left, I have to think very hard about how to move on. So yeah, to be sure, these technologies it is important to notice that specifically DNA phenotype is helpful when it hints at minority populations. So when it tells you that the profile is, say, as it happened in the analysis, is a Dutch white man, it doesn't help you much because the number of individuals is too large, and it doesn't focus the criminal investigation. I think that is an important thing to keep in mind. So, to the Marianne Vaatstra case, and let's hope that I can do this brief. As I indicated, there were hardly any evidence about the suspect. Next to bodily traces, there was sperm, pubic hair, some blood under the nails. There was another piece of evidence that was really important that entertained the mind of the public. This was the manner of death. The victim's throat was assumed cut through by a knife. The coroner, and later also a right-wing member of parliament, Pim Fortuyn, he was killed in the 2000s, he referred to this manner of death as a non-Dutch manner. And this obviously fueled the prejudice that was shared among the local population and hinted in the direction of the asylum seekers. But what did the forensic evidence say? There were some clues. One was, so here you can see that people were really angry as they assembled in the municipality. There were some clues. The pubic hair suggested that the secured hair indicated the perpetrator does not belong to the Negroid or Asian race, assuming he's Caucasian, and mined the language, the archaic language. A second clue said, based on DNA, told us that it is very plausible that the originator of the originator of the samples was of Dutch or Northwestern European descent. So here we have another kind of classification, nation states. A third clue came from the profiler 2 weeks after the DNA profile, which was immediately translated into whiteness, as you can see here, because it said extreme fantasies about sex, his age, where he probably lives, and the suspect is also white, which of course you cannot read off the crime scene, but was actually a translation of the genetic evidence that became available. Now, These three profiles together helped to redirect the attention of the investigating police away from the asylum seekers, but it did not really convince the local population. But what this shows is that sameness is really important in a forensic setting. You have to produce this category of sameness that help you to work on the case. So I want to share with you talk a little bit about the notion of phenotypic othering. Phenotypic othering as a way of attending to visible characteristics as a mode of producing a category of other. Now, despite the withering evidence, the local population and large portions of the media kept assuming that the perpetrator was to be found among the asylum seekers. The center was, in the view of the locals, a hotbed of criminal activities. So this suspicion of local population was further fueled by the crime reporter Peter R. de Vries. He's famous. I think he has also played a role here in the US. In 1999, he claimed that the main suspects were these former inhabitants of the asylum seekers center. Now, and they could be excluded through the DNA analysis, yet they still remain suspicious. And as I said, one of the pieces of evidence was this cutting of the throat of Marianne Vaatstra. And the scenario that Peter R. de Vries presented, it's the upper paragraph, the perpetrator was well prepared. It gives you a hint of how racialization occurs. Like a predator looking for a prey, he was waiting to attack Marianne from the bushes. And after that, he killed her by cutting her throat. And given this modus operandus, the suspect must have been an inhabitant of the asylum seeker center. And this was just, he was speaking out the minds of the local people. And this scenario is actually not exceptional because it is recurrent also in other cases, as you can see there below. So what we see here is actually a racialization, phenotypic othering, that does not only work through the body and its markers, but also through devices such as a knife and the use of the knife. And I think we have to be attentive to this kind of connections between different elements that come together. So, while DNA phenotyping and associated technologies are interlinked with the doing of sameness among ethnic minorities, as I indicated, familiar searching helps to produce sameness among local populations and in communities with a stable demography. This is something that I figured out looking at this case, that these technologies do different kinds of collectives, different kinds of same populations. And the racialization in the context of DNA phenotyping goes through this phenotypic othering. The racialization in the context of familiar searching comes about through reference to autochthony, belonging, ways of living together, and you will see this in the case. Now, a quick look at this familiar searching technology as it was used, and I cannot go into the details here. Yes, I shouldn't go into the details, so there's no time for that. So, let me start with this tweet that was published, went out on the 18th of November 2012, saying that the man is arrested, it's a white suspect, he's Frisian, he lives 2.5 kilometers from the crime scene, 100% DNA match. He's white, right? So this meant that after 12 years, the case was indeed solved. It hinted at a local farmer, and it happened through familiar searching. So they invited a man of the local population, 8,000 man plus, to come and donate DNA, and one of these men was the suspect himself. The idea was to find about maybe a father or a son or a nephew through this local population, but he happened to be among them. And it was interesting for me. This is when this usness appeared. When this went public, there was this community, a poor community up there that suffered from this case because they didn't know who the suspect was, and then suffered because it was one of them. And it's a community of us and mourning together. So here, this is really just a tiny selection of what the kind of arguments or the kind of moods that were in the population. It cannot be true. It must have been a mistake. If this is true, I lose my faith in humanity. And when everybody here believed that the perpetrator was an inhabitant of the asylum seeker center, that gave us at least some peace. You don't want it to be a father from here. And then, and this is for me the most interesting part actually, the father of the victim who has been very vocal. It is someone from our midst, a farmer, a white man. And this is not trivial. A farmer, a white man. We know that Roma people are classified, racialized through their occupation, right? So here, occupation figures in the white population, which I find really very interesting. As a way of concluding, ending, and referring to the theme of the session, the individual and the composite, one could say that whereas the Frisian suspect, Jasper S., would retain his individuality, and just to give you an idea, we would see how his privacy is protected as well. And there's very few pictures of him online. The phenotypically othered Ali that I've come to call symptomatic Ali was a suspect, part of a suspect population that is criminalized, bestialized, needed to be expelled. And it indicates that whereas Jasper S. was still on the wave of sameness, and he was still viewed as one of our kind, part of a machinery of racialization. And we could also say that although Ali was phenotypically othered and came to stand for a group of other kind, he lost his face. He became bestial kind, those who needed to be expelled and excluded. And related to this, we could also conclude that there are different machineries of sameness, and this is important. Sameness is not the same everywhere. There are versions of sameness that we came across in the familiar searching, through the familiar searching technology, that produce seemingly unmarked collectives. And if you look closely, of course, Dutch, white, and there is a kind of farming community that racializes this collective. But this version of sameness did not readily translate into individuals. It did not reduce all the individuals to one characteristics, but kept the, so it was, you could not say from there that all Dutch men have a tendency for crime or have a taste for raping and murdering young girls. Jasper S. was viewed as a singular case, and we know these cases, also here in the States, of course, quite often. He's a singular case and with specific individuality and a specific biography. Now, by contrast, the version of sameness that was based on phenotypic othering produced excludables. This version was much more virulent and generative. So the phenotypes translated into individuals who allegedly belonged to that group, and it kept on mobilizing support for how they are and what their behavior is about, linking homicides to phenotypic appearance. Now, this urges us not only to attend to sameness in understanding race, but also to attend to the different configurations of sameness and the effect that it has on science and society. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ahmad. That was very interesting. We'll have comments later. The next speaker is going to join us on the screen. Is she with us? There she is. This is Carolyn Roberts from Yale University, and she's going to be talking about medical violence and human commodification in the transatlantic slave trade. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So I'm not seeing her, but can you please stop because we're having difficulty hearing you? It needs to be corrected. Just a moment. Bear with us. Thank you. We're going to try again. Please go ahead.
Okay. Could you hear the beginning, or shall I just start from the beginning again?
Please start from the beginning. We didn't hear anything. Thank you.
Oh, okay, sure. So my talk today concerns medicine and violence, and such a topic is not unfamiliar to those knowledgeable about the history of people of African descent in the Americas, from enslaved bodies purchased for medical experimentation and subjected to painful surgical procedures, to forced sterilization, and from the Tuskegee syphilis experiments to the biopiracy of Henrietta Lacks's cells, we can narrate a litany of medical abuses in African American history. This morning, however, we will concern ourselves with the Atlantic slave trade. The medical world of the Atlantic slave trade represents one of the most neglected aspects of this world-changing historical event. The Atlantic slave trade was the largest forced oceanic migration ever to occur in human history. It lasted for nearly 400 years. Slave traders were responsible for the violent trafficking of over 12 million African children, women, and men to slave markets in the Americas. To carry out this brutal commerce in human beings, slave traders relied on an extensive intercontinental medical management system. The health of the enslaved was one of the most vital commodities in the Atlantic slave trade. Vendible bodies needed to arrive alive in the Americas. And one aspect of this medical management system concerns the European doctors who were hired to work on board slave ships. So we'll spend a few minutes thinking about the labor these doctors performed in the slave trade, and I will discuss the violent contours of slave trade medicine and the insidious uses to which medicine was put in the cruel conjoining of biology and economics, which facilitated the flow of profits across the Atlantic world. I will illustrate how slave trade medicine might be productively reread as a site of medical modernity in the British Atlantic world. And I will conclude by gesturing to how this troubling moment in our medical past has important implications for thinking through questions of race and medicine today. Doctors in the slave trade were critical figures in an extensive intercontinental supply chain where the products were people. The enslaved represented a very valuable but perishable commodity. And as a population, African captives represented a medical challenge in the context of the slave trade. Now, the challenge that Africans presented to British doctors was largely unrelated to what we have come to associate with medical meanings attached to biological markers of racial or ethnic difference. The emergent racial logics that Europeans increasingly attached to skin, hair, blood, brains, and nerves during the 18th century were not particularly salient in the clinical encounters that occurred in the slave ship's wooden world. Instead, a different kind of racial logics was at play. Rather than biological hierarchies of race, we are forced to confront social hierarchies and social status. Africans in the context of the slave trade represented a Black, incarcerated, and enslaved population. They were a population that doctors referred to as human cargo. The kind of medicine meted out to human cargo was of necessity violent and brutal, and acceptably so. For example, keeping hundreds of chained, beaten, and incarcerated human beings alive on these floating prisons went beyond managing infectious disease. Enslaved children, women, and men required whips, chains, and terror to quell their attempts to fight back, kill their captors, escape, or commit suicide. As Eric Robert Taylor writes, Africans fought back and fought back hard, refusing to go quietly into bondage. Doctors therefore committed chronic and pervasive violence to keep their incarcerated Black commodities alive. Refusing to eat, for example, was such a common occurrence that historian Marcus Rediker wrote that the Atlantic slave trade was in several respects a 400-year hunger strike. On board thousands of slave ships, doctors whipped African captives who refused to eat, lacerating their flesh to preserve them for sale. Medical practitioners were equipped with bolus knives, thumb screws, and the speculum oris to force feed the enslaved while breaking off their teeth in the process. When the enslaved attempted to hang themselves with rope in the night, mutilated themselves, tried to puncture their jugular veins by digging their fingers slowly through skin and flesh, doctors had to restrain them. Medical practitioners engaged in armed battle against the captives during shipboard insurrections. Doctors were equipped with a pharmaceutical arsenal, drove medicines down the throats of captive Africans, drained their blood, and plunged metal pipes into their rectums to administer enemas. Mariners pinned them down or hovered nearby with whips and pistols in hand to ensure they complied. During the course of an illness, some medical practitioners whipped, punched, and kicked and cursed the enslaved when they were on the brink of death, mourning the loss of their profits. Thomas Aubrey recounted that 6 slaves were kicked, punched, and beaten so often during their illnesses that some would cry out and, quote, creep under one of the platforms and hide themselves and die there, end quote. Dr. James Arnold summed up the situation quite aptly, explaining that the slave trade was conducted on the principle of force. And as you can see, surgeons were enmeshed in, and at times contributors to, its terrifying contours. There was little precedent for this form of medical practice in the 18th century British Isles. As a captive population, African people had been utterly dehumanized, rendered so socially and culturally inferior on one hand, and so economically valuable on the other, that medical violence wielded against their bodies and minds had become an acceptable, normative, and institutionalized practice across centuries. This forced African and African-descended people into a unique and troubling relationship with Western medicine before even setting foot in the Americas. But slave trade medicine, I argue, has explanatory power beyond the narration of violence and abuse, as important as that is if we wish to remember the dead. In addition to this, my work queries what slave trade medicine has to say about medicine itself. In training our gaze upon the 18th century, it would be easy to make the case that slave trade medicine shared little with 18th century medicine as a whole. In this sense, we might consider it a tragic aberration. But what happens if we locate slave trade medicine squarely within the medical trends of the period? The slave trade did not exist in a vacuum, abstracted from the wider world of 18th century medicine. In fact, as the slave trade and its medical labor needs accelerated during the second half of the 18th century, British medicine was also undergoing major changes. Medical theory, knowledge, and practice began making its initial shifts from early modern to modern medicine. Slave trade doctors were immersed in these incipient stirrings of medical modernity. The violent and violating contours of slave trade medicine in the later 18th century can, I suggest, be reckoned with by way of these changes. In doing so, slave trade medicine becomes a site of medical modernity with explanatory power that resonates in our present moment. Historian Susan Lawrence writes that anyone writing on the history of Western medicine between 1750 and 1850 deals in one way or another with the initial transition from early modern to modern medicine. It is unavoidable, she writes. And 2 developments that have long been identified as pivotal factors in the modernization of medicine during the 18th century recalibrated the patient-practitioner relationship in substantive ways. These were the centrality of the hospital in medical training, which brought pupils to patients' bedsides, and the study of anatomy, in particular pathological anatomy, which localized disease in the body by dissecting the dead. Living patients and their lifeless corpses, the former in the hospital and the latter in the dissecting amphitheaters and lecture halls that sprouted up across the British Isles, helped train students in new forms of patient objectification and clinical detachment. As students crowded around patients' bedsides or sliced and cut into the bodies of the dead, they were learning to understand a new kind of sick body. Previously, when patients fell ill, their disorders were linked to generalized internal imbalances in the humors or bodily fluids that circulated throughout the body. Humoral explanations of bodily ailments were highly individualized. Doctors made their diagnoses primarily by way of verbal exchanges with their patients in order to collaboratively search out various factors responsible for the dyscrasia or imbalance. The totality of the human being, including, the totality of the human being, including the patient's experiential understanding of disease, was crucial to diagnosis and cure. However, during the second half of the 18th century, morbidities were increasingly localized within organs and tissues rather than in invisible fluids. This provided an anatomical substratum to disease. In this new paradigm, diseases exhibited consistent features and were no longer defined by their unique manifestations in individual constitutions. According to famed Italian anatomist Giovanni Battista Morgagni, a patient's symptoms expressed the cry of the suffering organs. This signaled a change in the diagnostic process. The most important physical signs and symptoms were available only to practitioners, seemingly beyond the patient's knowledge and reach. Rather than the patient's narrative directing the clinical encounter, the patient's body drove the exchange. As Mary Fissel writes so adeptly, quote, "The locus of absolute truth began to lie deep inside the body, accessible only to infirmary men. The patient's words were not relevant. His or her body spoke instead," end quote. As the 18th century progressed, clinicians taught students a form of medical practice that estranged the sick body from the individual's experience of suffering and its meanings. While the bodies of the living were being newly conceptualized as depersonalized clinical objects, the bodies of the dead were becoming valuable commodities. If a patient's symptoms expressed the cry of the suffering organs, that cry could only be fully understood and confirmed after death through dissection. Anatomists correlated external symptoms from the patient's clinical history with internal lesions observable upon death. In other words, clinico-pathological correlation. The quest for dead bodies was not only useful in studying disease, however. Dissection helped aspiring doctors develop medical dispassion, or what William Hunter called necessary inhumanity toward the living. Practicing on the dead was crucial in allowing young doctors to become accustomed to foul odors and to cut into bodies that didn't cry out or struggle. Under a dissector's gaze, the human body became neutral, anonymous, and even mechanistic. Dead bodies were needed for this knowledge project, and a burgeoning body trade developed. To the distress and anxiety of hospital patients, their corpses were now valuable commodities. Private anatomy schools and hospitals across the British Isles resorted to grave robbing and celebrated law breaking for the benefit of medical science. Future slave trade doctors became accustomed to dwelling in the intersection between the needs of anatomical instruction on one hand and what one observer described as the flagrant outrages upon humanity on the other. These young medical men encountered institutionalized patients and the stolen dead in ways that thwarted traditional moral codes and social propriety for the benefit of medical knowledge. the institutional culture of the hospital and the dissecting theater encouraged students to strive after clinical detachment, to be proud of their steeliness in the face of vivisected animals shrieking, or poxed women exposed and trembling before rowdy male medical students. Admittedly, such skills were of the utmost necessity in order to save their patients' lives. They needed to be able to cut quickly and proficiently into human bodies without the benefit of anesthesia, when speed and dexterity could mean life or death. In this respect, pain and healing, violence and curing were deeply entangled. Aspiring doctors negotiated the boundaries of both, needing to embrace the contours of each in order to be effective practitioners. Yet the slave trade required additional recalibration. As medical practitioners met its unique challenges and became captors. Doctors wielded violence outside of the operating theater. They trafficked in suffering detached from patients' bedsides, and they purchased human lives. In this historical moment, which experienced nascent groaning pains of medical modernity, when patients' voices were increasingly silenced and their experience of suffering was no longer pivotal to the clinical encounter, the slave trade crystallized and amplified these emergent shifts in the patient-practitioner relationship in an insidious new way, hardening their edges, perhaps beyond recognition. If medicine was becoming depersonalized and disempowering for the sick across the British Isles, and indeed across the British Atlantic world, the slave trade offers one of its most extreme institutionalized expressions, sweeping up millions of captive Africans into its steely grip. Doctors' dispassion toward the African people under their care, the brutality they wielded, and the terror they instilled, shows in chilling ways how the very tools of medicine, the skills most necessary for its success, exist in the most fragile of spaces and are so easily transmuted into forms of profound harm. For the enslaved who only experienced white medical faces at the end of a lash, or when the cervix was being forced open on the African coast while women wept, their stories offer a haunting reminder. They remind us that millions of enslaved children, women, and men trafficked across the Atlantic bore within them violent, savage, and terrifying medical memories that lived in their bodies and minds. When we trace the history of medical abuse in African American history, we must remember that even before setting foot in the Americas, captive Africans were already in the process of trying to heal and repair from the violations of slave trade medicine. We must push our temporal and geographical orientation back in time and space to reckon with the uniquely brutal relationship people of African descent have had with Western medicine. Before notions of African biological inferiority fully matured, African people were already utterly dehumanized in the context of the slave trade. Cultural and social inferiority, coupled with their economic value, gave birth to a new form of medicine that normalized, naturalized, and institutionalized medical violence against them. And this lasted for nearly 400 years. Ideas of Black inferiority continue to shape the medical care of people of African descent in the United States and around the world. The patient-practitioner relationship remains fraught. Biases and stereotypes result in disparate treatment. Abuses wielded against people of African descent in the context of medicine splash across our news feeds with stark regularity. Clinical detachment, medical dispassion, and patient objectification remain ongoing challenges in the medical profession. In regard to the slave trade, the medical students I teach tell me that they feel as if they are living in the aftermath of this history, particularly when they see how white clinicians treat Black patients. Medicine remains in need of healing, and the slave trade reminds us that social hierarchies engender racial fictions that profoundly shape the patient-practitioner relationship and continue to wield harm. Disrupting this harm is a matter of life and death. Thank you.
Well, that was an excellent presentation. The next person that will be speaking with us is Shirley Sun from the Nanyang Technological University, and I'll ask her to introduce herself. Thank you.
Right. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me clearly? Yeah. Okay. Before I begin, I would like to thank Professor Dorothy Roberts and Iram Alam for organizing the symposium. This is a wonderful topic and very important for global dialogue, and also for giving me the chance to share the work. Okay, I have a special interest in medical sociology and also sociology of science, which will be obvious given the work that I'm going to present today. Okay. So this paper is a part of a larger research project titled Addressing Social Issues in Precision Medicine. And the goal is to describe and to understand the perceptions and experiences of clinicians and clinician scientists practicing precision medicine, primarily in the context of the cancer problem in USA, Canada, and in Singapore. And of course, I have to sample the sites. It's not going to be representative as the title suggests. Okay, so let's take a look at what concerns me here is rhetorically, precision medicine refers to the ability to classify individuals into subpopulations that differ in their susceptibility to a particular disease. I will let you read the rest. The final sentence, preventive or therapeutic interventions can be concentrated on those who will benefit, sparing experience and expense and side effects of those who will not. So on the surface, precision medicine promises to target the individual, but you can see from the definition already that the reality is that doctors have to be able to classify individuals into subpopulations. And how we define populations, both in terms of how scientists define it and how doctors profile patients, are the concern here. And this is a definition given by the US National Research Council. I should acknowledge where it comes from. Existing studies have shown that racialized population groups can be strategically appropriated by interested parties to the detriment of the health and healthcare of individuals, designated as members of the racialized and ethnicized groups. For example, Dorothy Roberts critically examined the notion of pharmacoethnicity in her book, Fatal Invention. And Jonathan Kang argues that the primary forces driving the reinvention of Bidol, a drug for treating heart failure, as an ethnic drug were legal and commercial rather than biomedical, in his book, Race in a Bottle. In addition, Pamela Sanker and Jonathan Kang also noted that correctly, rather than receiving the promised more affordable treatments, the targeted racialized population found their healthcare costs increased. So today I'm going to draw your attention on the other side of the same phenomenon. Those two books were concerned about efficacy studies, drug efficacy studies. I'm going to talk about drug toxicity studies. There's an ongoing debate in the clinical world about the usefulness of such studies. On the one hand, you can see that some scholars argue that definitively pharmacogenomic or pharmacogenetic information should be used to reduce toxicity for patients. On the other hand, there are also others who argue that due to cost and other institutional considerations, it's going to be hard to have pharmacogenomic information unique to individual to be implemented in the healthcare. The way that I approach this topic is I engage in two kinds of analysis. One is, of course, looking at documents about how drugs are developed and marketed and implemented in the clinical site. And I also do interview studies with clinicians and clinician scientists. So this is an approach known as phenomenology, trying to understand how people who are doing this or practicing precision medicine, how they experience the phenomenon. And if you want to know more about the methodology, we can talk about more. But yeah, let's get to the findings. So first of all, I would like to highlight that there are commonly identified problems which doctors mention and the scientists mention that constrain the clinical utility of drug-related adverse drug reaction genetic testing. And that is corroborated, that's mentioned already in the existing literature and in the interview data. I'll elaborate on it in a few seconds. But I also want to highlight that there are new insights or new findings given the interview data. They're mainly concerned about three things. One is the construction of genetic risk estimates. Of course, the social construction of genetic risk estimates. And also how these kinds of pharmacogenomic testing is taking too long. If you don't think about the ideal, but think about practically, the doctors are saying that it's taking too long to be effective in the clinical setting. And finally, of course, the racialization and ethnicization of pharmacogenomic studies, focusing on drug toxicity. Now, before I get to the findings, I would like to say that no one is arguing against the goal of using pharmacogenomic information for the sake of reduction of adverse drug reaction. I think no matter whether you're a social scientist or a natural scientist, the goal is the same. We are interested in the reduction of adverse drug reaction. The difference is how we approach that goal. And another finding that's interesting from the interview data is the pharmaceutical industry's interest in such studies. Now, one of the interviewees said that, interestingly, as a scientist, he specializes in drug toxicity studies. And what he shared was that when he found out certain genetic variant that will make someone more likely to get adverse drug reaction, the pharmaceutical company, in this case Pfizer, was not very happy. He said that his finding scared them because based on his finding, patients potentially can use such findings to sue the pharmaceutical industry or the company in this case. So the first thing I want to point out is that the pharmaceutical companies, even though they're reluctant, they have to carry out these toxicity studies due to legal requirement, not intrinsically to their own interest, which is different from their interest in doing efficacy studies, right? They make use of racial and ethnic groups for the sake of creating efficacy studies. Okay, so that's the first thing that differs from efficacy studies and toxicity studies. Now, I mentioned in the title that there's ongoing tensions. So in the finding, there are, of course, interviewees who highlight the benefits of these studies. And you can see that, theoretically, with this new knowledge, we are going to be better off because it provides more comprehensive understanding of the benefits and risk of drug therapy. And also the collected data, biological data, should also help the scientists to build genetic risk prediction models that then in turn, hopefully or theoretically, can shape the treatment decision-making process. So one of the doctors in the US mentioned, for example, everybody is looking for a precise medicine nowadays. If you can identify a polymorphism from a clinical trial, and interestingly, the group that responds the least has the greatest toxicity, that's a really good thing to identify. So SNPs like that will be of importance for clinicians. And there are other quotes. I won't go into each one. So just to let you know that there are benefits, perceived benefits, and real benefits for having these new studies. However, at the same time, the data also overwhelmingly suggests that there's limits or constraints on such scientific findings in the clinical settings. And these 5 dimensions or aspects of the findings are in line with what we know already from reading up on the literature on pharmacogenomic studies. The first thing is that when it comes to cancer treatment, there is a serious trade-off between efficacy and toxicity. So for example, one of the doctors said that, I don't think it's entirely clear what the implication of efficacy will be. We're treating cancer, so you don't want to reduce doses. With all chemotherapies, the way that we come out with the doses is based on treating until we get an intolerable level of toxicities, known as maximum tolerated dose. For colorectal cancer, they're looking at different combinations, but they're not looking at pharmacogenomic adjustment. This is a Canadian doctor's comments. On the second point, when there's a situation of no better alternative for treatment available, the doctors also find the information not useful. For example, a Singapore doctor said that the problem of carbamazepine adverse drug reaction was thought to be a significant enough event that a cost effectiveness study was done. Some economic health economics projections suggest that it may be worthwhile to do pharmacogenomic testing. So the Singapore Ministry of Health accepted it and sent out the circular to all doctors. Nonetheless, it is not mandated in the sense that doctors still have the freedom to decide whether he thinks it should be done or not. Because sometimes we have no other choice, meaning that besides this particular medicine, you don't have any other choice for the patient. And on the third dimension, sometimes the tests have not been proven better than the existing method. One of the most commonly cited examples concerns warfarin and also irinotecan. So warfarin, doctors with the genomic information, they still have to do observation. They still have to make sure that the blood clock in a given time. So with the genomic information, it's helpful, but it doesn't mean that it's better than the existing method. They still have to do the observational adjustment. And for irinotecan, one of the doctors in Singapore mentioned that irinotecan can be given in several ways. It can be given once every 3 weeks, or it can be given on a weekly basis. And you can adjust the dosage based on the observed toxicities. So in the context of nothing else to offer to this particular patient for whatever reason, you're still going to try this method anyway. So they find that genomic information is not as helpful. The fourth aspect of why they find this new information not as helpful in the clinical setting has to do with the very fact that drug-related toxicity is a continuous, not a dichotomous variable, meaning that you have a range of toxic or adverse reaction to a particular drug, diarrhea, or moderate diarrhea, or very severe diarrhea where you have to get to the hospital. So what they're saying is that individual patients have very different reactions, and there's a spectrum of reactions, and therefore you cannot just, or one cannot just use a particular genomic information and decide whether to give this drug or not to a particular patient. And the fifth reason why they say that this new information also has limited clinical utility has to do with another fact, that drug-related toxicity is also affected by non-genetic factors such as diet. Okay, I'm going to give a few more examples on this point, because I think this is probably more of interest. Okay, so for example, in the literature, and I will highlight the literature in a minute. In the literature, in the published literature, there is data to show the racialization and ethnicization of the pharmacogenomic toxicity studies. So in the literature, it is documented or found that African Americans are particularly prone to have 5-FU toxicity. Now, the doctor says, one of the doctors, in the United States, our food is enriched with folate. And so, for example, toxicity for 5-FU is different in the population that eats folate-enriched food. If you are getting the 5-FU toxicity effect, it's going to be higher, the chances are higher with the enrichment than if you don't have such diet enriched. So it's not something that's necessarily genetic, although genetic may play a part in it. It's really a dietary thing. This is about FFU and how diet actually affects whether someone will suffer from adverse drug reaction from taking this drug. Another example is about Warfarin. This is from a Singapore doctor. He said a certain kind of herbal tea, even simple like chamomile tea, will affect the coagulation of warfarin. So we cannot tell patients that you cannot eat this or you cannot drink that, because then there will be 1,000 things to avoid. If a patient has cough or cold and they went to see a general practitioner and get some medicine, that would interfere with warfarin, and you will run into trouble. So they're trying to explain why it's not just about genetics. And a final example from Canada. The doctor said that my experience is actually that diet has a stronger influence on toxicity effect. When people take warfarin and eat some broccoli, the INR, this is the indicator that doctors look for, go up and down. That's the problem. It has nothing to do with how fast you metabolize, or nowadays we have the drug label categorizing people into poor metabolizer or ultra fast metabolizer. So the doctor is saying that it has nothing to do with how fast you metabolize. If you take the wrong diet, it will interfere with how the body reacts to the drug. So those are the examples for why, or explanations for why there's the limitations of looking only at genetics. Now, in addition to those concerns or issues, in the data, it also shows that even if we ignore those concerns or ignore those issues, and we want to implement this pharmacogenomic testing in the healthcare and press forward, there's an issue of time. The current time span needed is too long for toxicity effects to be useful or meaningful in making clinical decisions. And the doctors mentioned gave again a few examples. I'm gonna just highlight. So for example, in this doctor interview, it's a long quote, but essentially, right, the wait time of the test, and also DPD deficiency. This has to do with 5FU toxicity, right? And you can see that the doctors are saying that the basic test takes a month to get back. You cannot wait for a month in order to decide whether to give this drug to a patient. The second issue has to do with how risk estimation and the construction of risk is also a social, not necessarily a biological phenomenon. Okay, I'm going to give you a few examples. There are lots of patients that have certain polymorphism but do not have toxicity. So the predictive power is not as strong as we would like it to be, right? So doctors are doing genetic testing for efficacy, but for toxicity, they're not doing it. And we can go back to those other quotes if you're interested in finding out more. I just want to make sure that I complete the talk in time. So in addition to the issue of how the reliability and predictive power of the information, also the value judgment of the risk estimates is subjective. There are differences in the way in which the figures are presented. Okay, let's see. Okay. I'm just going to read this particular quote from a Canadian doctor, interview with a Canadian doctor. He said, if somebody says, well, 2% of Asians will have an adverse drug reaction to this drug, and only 0.1% of Caucasians will have an adverse effect, you could say that, you can present the figure as, there's a 20-fold increased risk Asians have an adverse drug reaction, so we should not give them the drug. Well, obviously, I don't agree with that, because 2% is still small risk, right? So it depends on how you present the figure to the patient and to the doctors that will shape how the drug will be used or not. And they're questioning the subjective definitions of or presentation of risk estimates. This is a nice segue into my final elements of findings that I want to share, and that has to do with racial and ethnic-based population toxicity studies. Some of the doctors are finding it useful. So for example, one of the doctors says that to her, it seems perfectly reasonable that if you identify African Americans were of a higher risk of toxicity from this particular drug, maybe then that's the subpopulation that you do a broad testing. So this is known as screening based on racial and ethnic groups. So there are doctors that think that they have no issue with it. And you can find, or we found lots of examples of racialized pharmacogenomic studies on toxicity. I won't go into all that. I'll just give you one example. Okay. Right. In the previous slides, all these studies are done locally, meaning that they're done, carried out in the US or in Canada or in Singapore. And the scientists will usually justify why they used race and ethnicity in their study. But I want to highlight here that in this global era, you can have studies done elsewhere, right? In this case, Asia, and have an impact on how doctors in the US prescribe medicine. Okay, so this is a label. This is a label of carbamazepine. You can check online, and this is the exact label that they have. What you see is a racialized information, right? It's stated here that 1 to 6 per 10,000 new users in countries with mainly Caucasian populations, but the risk in some Asian countries is estimated to be about 10 times higher. Now, the way in which they substantiate this claim, the FDA-approved label, is they draw on studies in Thailand, in Taiwan, in Japan, and of course in Singapore. And in the label, it also says that studies in patients of Chinese ancestry have found to be there's a strong association between the risk of developing Stevens-Jones syndrome and also the presence of HLA-B 1502, an inherited allele variant of this gene. So what they say is that the doctors can consider screening for Asian ancestry patients. Now, some doctors, many doctors actually, most oncologists warn against using such information. So so what I want to highlight is that their hands are tied, because if they don't really follow the legal regulation or they don't consider the label, they may be liable for lawsuits, right, as doctors who care for patients. Nonetheless, I want to highlight there are internal concerns. They want to say that there's maybe some problems with these racialized studies as basis for making medical decisions. They do not really talk about the social and historical formation of these categories, racialized categories, as sociologists do or historians do. They have other concerns. They're concerned about heterogeneity of populations and intermarriages. So, right, okay. I guess it's enough to say that the drug doesn't care about race, right? So why are we so caught up in this paradigm, racialized paradigm? Okay, I'm going to conclude on the debate over the clinical utility. There's substantial evidence to suggest that most oncologists do not find such studies useful due to various reasons noted. And one of them would be, right, the construction of the presentation of genetic risk is mainly a social phenomenon rather than biological phenomenon. And even if you ignore that, test turnaround time is too slow for the doctors. And more importantly, the use of race and ethnicity in population-based genomic studies complicates and constrains the clinical applicability. However, without changing the prevailing ideology of racially and ethnically defined diversity inclusion paradigm and the drug regulatory authorities' democratic rules and regulations, here prominently US FDA risk regulation, we're likely to see more instances of racialization and ethnicization of precision medicine, ironically, in the form of, including in the form of pharmacogenomic studies of drug toxicity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that, Shirley. So now we'll have a few comments, and I'm going to put my water here, because I always have to drink water while I talk. So I found these papers very interesting, and one of the things that I thought was so amazing was that they were so different, and yet they all did speak very very directly to what the prompt had been. So I'm just going to talk briefly about each one and then open it up for questions. One of the things that I thought was interesting in Amade's paper, and maybe given the way we typically encounter DNA typing in criminal situations might not be as clear, is how distinctive DNA phenotyping is, that it is not the same process at all as DNA typing, which is match one sample from a crime scene to a sample from a person. And the point of DNA phenotyping is that you can take just a sample from a crime scene and generate an image of the person. And I think it's very important to sort of clarify how different these technologies are. And what is important in vis-a-vis the paper is that all DNA phenotyping ever intends to do is to create a pool of suspects, to create a collective from which then ideas for pursuing a criminal can be generated. So one of the things that I thought was interesting was when I thought of cases in the United States and how different they were from the one that we heard about, and whether or not the differences mean anything for what Amade was saying about let's focus on sameness, let's focus on the production of sameness. So there's a case in the United States briefly where somebody had been committing rape, serial rapist, and for years he eluded police, and finally they used DNA phenotyping, and they had always believed for a set of reasons that this was a white man. And when they did the DNA phenotyping, it came up that the description from the company was light-skinned black man. And that piece of information flipped the case, and the person was arrested very quickly. So it did not play out in the press. It did not involve communities the way the Dutch case did. And I guess that is one of my questions. Is the production of sameness in the case that Amade was talking about, is it about where it plays out, what the context is, for whom people are performing? Because the production of sameness as a sociological phenomenon is something that is studied all the time. How do we make ourselves members of communities? How do we perform whiteness? There's a lot that's been done on that. So that was just one question that I had. Yeah, all right, I think that's all. I mean, I have others, but I don't want to get in the way of other people having questions. So I think that Carolyn Roberts' paper, I have to tell you, kept me up last night because it was very amazing, and I hope it is a book project because I would love to read more about that. So one of the things I thought looking at reading that was making me reperceive the function of medical education and whether there might not be a benefit to thinking of it as one of the processes through which people learn to produce sameness. And what it raises questions to me, the classic story, which was somewhat in your paper, of what's the function of medical students learning to objectify bodies. So in the example you gave, they have to perform an amputation. In examples that we give is, who can wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and run down the hall and slit open somebody's stomach and stick their hand in? I can't, most of us can't, but that's what you're being trained to be able to do. So there is a positive spin is put on it. So yes, it's regrettable that you're objectifying people, but it's a benefit because we get to live. So I guess one question, sorry. Can never get more than 4 or 5 minutes. Is that part of the model? Is the violence that was produced inherent in the assumptions behind the education? Mm. And of course, then what kind of implications might that have? And specifically, what was interesting to me was there was a line, at least in the written paper, where you said, what was curious was that these physicians did not treat whites and blacks differently during diagnosis and treatment. So it raised the question to me of, were they who are the people that went and became these doctors? Is that part of it? So just to explain that and sort of understand whether it's part of the objectification process or whether, of course, there's something else, and I'm sure there is something more complex there. But one of the things I thought was interesting that linked all these papers together is that Dr. Roberts' paper pivots on this transition to the modern era in medicine, and it's written up and very often characterized as what happens is it's the leaving behind the interest in the individual, leaving behind the interest in the story. I do think that's probably, I think it's accurate. I also think it's probably a little bit of a romanticization, but what's interesting then is that we get Shirley's paper, and precision medicine, in theory, is trying to change that. They're saying, no, medicine should not be based on our understanding of your membership in a group, that's the failing of medicine, that the modern era introduced a kind of medicine, one size fits all, and one size does not fit all. And one of the clearest demonstrations of that are the problems with adverse drug reactions. I do think it's important to understand in Shirley's presentation that there are very different kinds of toxicity testing. So as a drug is being developed in the lab, before it can go out, when they make the transition from an animal model to a human model, there's a toxicity test. And that's what's required by law. If they fail that, the drug does not ever go to market. So that's one set of toxicity tests. What she was talking about more is this implementation of precision medicine, the idea being that there's information out there that we can understand why people react differently to treatments. And this is part of the whole push to integrate genomics into routine care. So it is the case, just interestingly, that in Great Britain, they don't call it precision medicine or personalized medicine. They call it stratified medicine. And that's actually pretty accurate, because what you're doing is you're not individually tailoring it. You're making smaller groups than we used to make. So if you pick up your aspirin bottle, it'll still say, well, if you have this, if you're under 2, don't take it, or if you have this, don't take it. So there's some minor sense that we're not all the same. But the push to precision medicine is to make things smaller, based, even though they'd like to say it's not only your genomics, for now, it really is based on your genomics. So that's the push. It's to integrate genomics to find out if there's genetic variation that influences the way you respond to drugs. So one thing to keep in mind is that although this has been around for a while, it's not, I can't say it's not the intent for it to end up in primary care, but at this point, many of the technologies really are intended not for primary care. And so the fact that they don't have a quick turnaround time, or the fact that they don't give a clear answer is important to pay attention to, because a lot of money is being spent on it. But it also has a lot to do with the stage of the evolution of precision medicine. And one of the things that is very important to stay alert to were the kinds of things that Shirley brought up, which is the point of how much money, that this is the future of medicine. And I hate phrases like that, but it is. And so there are a lot of reasons to pay attention to it, and to understand it, and to criticize it, and to really get at the basis of it. And one thing that might be interesting in terms of the interest that Shirley has in terms of the intersection of pharmacogenetics, or precision medicine broadly, and race, is to look at how the physicians are defining, how the researchers are defining what they mean by race, how they're recruiting their population. So it brings it back again to the question of this panel, which is, we create populations to serve particular needs, we put individuals in there, and then we attribute the features of what the population we created, we attribute those features to the individual people. And that's what's going on when they create a research population and pull them into precision medicine. So that might be a very interesting thing to look at. For the panel in general, I just have one question that always comes up when I read these things, and that is that I always read them in a context in which this finding of similarity and finding of difference is demonized in some way. It's bad, and I agree with that. And yet it is a fundamental cognitive process. And so that's a question that's interesting to me, is how do you think about that when you're looking at situations in which the outcomes are, in fact, very dire? Thanks. So I will sit over there and I'll call on.
For Dr. Sun. I know in the oncology field that there's a lot of nebulous areas or gray areas about why things might work or not work. One of the examples you showed really briefly was Plavix, clopidogrel, which is like the second most prescribed medication in the US, and it's also kind of like the best known model we have that has a clear connection to the enzymatic metabolism. So 15 to 40% of people walking around can't ever activate Plavix. There's also like a fast test for Plavix that can be done in just a couple hours. And so it's kind of like the best case scenario, but the PGX testing for Plavix is still not standard of care. So I was wondering if, in your interviews, did you get a sense for why that's still a barrier? It's a clear-cut connection, there's a fast test, there's a lot of people who this would affect. There's even like a black box label now on Plavix prescriptions, but that says this might not work for you, but we're still not kind of testing patients as a routine. Do you get any sense from those physicians that you interviewed why we still don't do it?
Right. I think this goes back to my earlier, the one of the slides that I showed, that the physicians actually has a quite sophisticated understanding of genetics and drug adverse reaction. So you are saying that scientifically we know the link, right? But you're assuming that it's the genetic causing the drug effect, adverse reaction. What they're saying is that there are other factors, there are a list of concerns that I have. For example, if this is the only drug, even though it's the most commonly prescribed, but what if this is the only drug that they can prescribe? Then knowing or not knowing the pharmacogenomic information makes no difference in clinical decision. That's one of the most commonly cited reasons. If this is the only drug you have, and you are going to try it, you just need to adjust the dosage, right? So if adjusting dosage is a method, it's also possible to do without genomic testing. And finally, like I said, going back to the earlier point, that it's not just about genetics. You can statistically find the significance. I'm not questioning that significance, but the situation is more complex, right? And I also wonder, actually, when you say that 15% to 20% of the general population, right? That estimates, that calculation of 15% and 20% itself is a social process, right? How do you arrive at that 15% to 20%? Is it general US population? So what I mean is that's what the doctors are saying, that when they hear such percentage, they don't know what that means clinically, because they cannot, so their concern is that they cannot make a mistake for this individual patient in front of them. Maybe on the population side, that's useful information to have, 15%. So one out of five may suffer from the problematic reaction. But what does that mean for this particular individual patient? So that's one thing. So you're saying that the test, so testing time comes out quite. Cost of the testing, how is it?
So it's covered by Medicaid, Medicare, and most insurances if you have a reason.
So cost is taken out as a reason. Okay, so yeah. So I think that there are other reasons that's involved, basically a more holistic understanding that the doctors actually have. So I think this is interesting, because when I was hearing Caroline's presentation, I think the doctors actually are telling us that
individual patients and why they react to certain drugs is a more complicated problem than just linking genetics to their reaction to drugs. So, yeah, sure.
Spoken so much already.
Yeah. You mentioned in your talk that part of the reason why the facial recognition technology or phenotyping is more useful in identifying the refuge, the asylum seekers, is because there are more white Danish people. Right? And so it's less useful because of the large
size of the population.
And I wonder if it's just about the size of the population or if there are ways in which it seems less useful for certain groups than other groups, regardless of the size. Is this a minority-majority issue or is there something else going on?
Yeah.
And the other question I had also for you was whether or not this technology itself is helping create racial divisions or different configurations of race.
Yeah.
Because in the U.S., we would classify those asylum seekers as white. The ones you showed.
Yes.
But even in the U.S., I'm wondering if they are less and less considered white, people from the Middle East, Northern Africa. And I'm wondering if you've seen that in Denmark, that...
Netherlands.
The Netherlands.
Never mind.
Sorry about that.
They're both very bad, Denmark and the Netherlands.
But if there's some interaction of the use of these technologies, the perception of the race of the asylum seekers and differing, changing racial categorizations in the Netherlands.
Oh, there's quite a list of questions. Now, I'm wondering whether maybe I'll leave your question, Pamela, on sameness, because I think so. It is. I didn't want to say anything in general about these technologies, but their specific use there, and I think with time duration. So if a case takes longer, I bet you DNA phenotyping will produce this collective of a phenotypic other. And I think in the case that you described, which is a famous case, obviously as well in the States, there was something going on that was producing a kind of sameness. But as I indicated, when sameness is about a white collective, it doesn't necessarily produce a marginalized category or a category that needs extra attention. So it is still a collection of individuals that somehow share similarities. So yes, these technologies, specifically DNA phenotyping, are really race-producing technologies because race is the value that sells. That's the basic thing. I mean, we do not care about each and every individual and how she or he looks like, because that doesn't help in the criminal investigation. So we have to think very pragmatically and practically about where is this technology being used. And it is, often very hectic situation. There's societal pressure, political pressure to solve a high-profile case. And in these cases, it is really ethnicity or geographical descent that matters. So that is what you go by. And indeed, if it would be hinting at a general population, it does produce a racialized category, but it is not a relevant category for political investigators, because where do you begin? So that is time consuming, and so you want to reduce the size of the population. So the size of the population is indeed important because of the pragmatics of the trade. There's only that much time and that much capacity. Am I missing? Yes. Yeah. About the Dutch situation, I think, and also in relation to the States, the world has changed since 9/11, and it was already changing in Europe before that vis-a-vis the Muslim threats. So this is a category that is more and more racialized, and I mean the kind of talk is really troubling, and it is really grim in the sense that we're not just talking about a religious group that you might like or dislike, but it is really cast in evolutionary terms. So don't even bother. Them are different. Yeah.
One more question, and then we'll take a break before the. Yeah,
So I have this question for Carolyn. Wonderful paper, wonderful dissertation, going to be a wonderful book. I'm looking forward to it. But the point about under the sort of medical management of the slave trade, that the doctors didn't treat the black bodies as different. But I want to push you to say more about that, because I think what you've demonstrated is the slave ship is not a clinic, and it's not a dissecting table. It is a different, fundamentally different kind of space, if you will, where the bodies in that space are both commodities and humans. So they're useful because they are human, but they also have great value because they're commodities. So that does add a different lens, and could that aspect of it also contribute to the fact that the violence that occurs becomes normalized? So there is at the core of comparing those sites where medical management is happening, where the clinical practices and the doctor-patient relationship is absolutely violated in the slave trade management, to what happens in the dissecting table where people can't talk back, to a space that's an extremely complicated one, but allows the education to become dispassionate, to objectify, to be even heightened. So am I sort of, I'm trying to push you to say a little bit more about how you make those kinds of comparisons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, one of the things that was surprising to me when I was studying the literature on the slave trade is that in terms of the treatment of disease and the treatment of illnesses, that there wasn't much of a distinction between white and black bodies on the slave ships and in the slave trade more broadly. And so thinking about the difference by way of more of the social world and the fact that they are black commodities, and the way that commodification is also happening in the British Isles more broadly, with the use of patients as teaching tools and and in these postmortems. And so one of the things that I've been trying to do, which is very difficult because of the kinds of sources that are remaining, is trying to make sense of how did doctors use whatever kinds of intellectual resources that they were getting in the British Isles through their education and even from their previous work in the Navy into the slave ship space. And so, I am making a kind of reasoned speculation about how some of these sort of modes of being, because one of the things that I find really interesting about this moment in British medicine is that there are new sort of styles of doctoring. There's a new mode of sort of being a doctor. Some scholars describe how, the hardened surgeon is becoming more of a trope during this period of time. And thinking about that in relationship to the slave trade, and especially in tracing where these doctors are training with some of the top surgeon anatomists in London, is one of the ways that I've been trying to make these connections. But you're right. I mean, these different spaces that they're operating in are they're really fundamentally different. And so one of the moves that I've been trying to make is to think about, is there anything that they share? Because it does seem, in some ways, like such an aberration. So I hope that helps explain it a little bit better.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And we'll take a very brief break.